lot that comes to mind when we talk about civil rights. But today what we're going to be talking about are three very important Supreme Court cases that forever change the landscape of the United States. Three court cases are going to be Dred Scott, Plessy v. Ferguson, and Brown v. the Board of Education. These are three landmark Supreme Court cases in United States history, all regarding civil rights. The Supreme Court is the highest court in the land. It is comprised of 9 people that are deemed to be the most equipped to deal with these type of cases. They wear nice robes and they make important decisions. The first case we're going to talk about is Dred Scott v. Sandford. Dred Scott was a slave who moved to Illinois with his owner. When his owner passed away, he thought he could have his freedom. Everyone wants to be free. So after his owner passed away, he tried to buy his freedom. The widow of the owner refused to let him go free. Dred Scott said, well, since I'm in Illinois, it's a free state. I should be a free man, right? We'll see. So he sues the widow, and it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. And the case is argued, the 9 Supreme Court justices deliberate, and they come to a decision. They think long and hard about it. The case in front of them is, does Dred Scott, a freed slave living in Illinois, is he now a freed man? What they rule is one of the biggest mistakes in United States history. They say that no, Dred Scott is not a free man. They say he is property. Now I want you to stop and think about that for a second. Property. What's property? This, a cell phone, is this property? Car keys, this is property. This is property. I own this. I can do this whatever I want. So when you go home today and you play video games or you talk to your friends, you go on the internet, do whatever you may do, that's you having freedom. You get to make the choices there. I want you to stop and think for a second. What if you didn't have that freedom? What if you were property? You belonged to someone else. Someone owned you. They owned you and got to control every aspect of your life. They could say, no, you can't go to school. You have to work 14 hours days on a farm every day. You are now property. That's what the Supreme Court said about African American slaves. That's what they said. They said a living, breathing human being like you or me is not a person, rather property. One of the biggest mistakes in United States history. The next case we're going to talk about is Plessy v. Ferguson. Homer Plessy was an intelligent man. He wanted to prove a point, so he bought a ticket for a railroad car, a whites-only railroad car. Homer Plessy was 1/8 African American. However, he gets on the whites-only train, and they say you're not allowed here. Even though he's only 1/8 African American, because he boarded a whites-only rail car, they forced him out. Homer Plessy kind of knew this was going to happen, but he wanted to prove a point. So he sues, and it goes again to the highest court in the land. These are supposed to be 9 very intelligent individuals that are supposed to create justice. The case is called Plessy v. Ferguson. The Supreme Court, once again, is deliberating the issue. Is separate but equal constitutional? The issue in front of the Supreme Court is Homer Plessy, a person that is 1/8 African American, allowed to board a rail car for whites only. The 9 individuals, the 9 Supreme Court justices deliberate this, and what they say is no, he is not allowed to board this rail car. As long as things are kept separate but equal, it's okay. So just because it's a whites-only rail car doesn't mean it's illegal. As long as there's a blacks-only rail car that is equal to the whites-only rail car, it's constitutional. This is once again one of the most egregious mistakes in United States history. Dred Scott v. Sandford, Plessy v. Ferguson, these both set blacks' rights back After the Civil War, slavery is abolished. Just because slavery is abolished doesn't mean that African Americans suddenly have all the same rights as white people. Just because slavery is abolished doesn't mean that racism doesn't exist anymore. That doesn't mean that there's not still a sentiment of hatred towards African Americans. And we see that when we learn things about Dred Scott and we learn about Plessy v. Ferguson. It's going to take a long time before African Americans gain equal rights under the government. I would argue it could be all the way until 1970, until African Americans obtain the same rights as whites. Today, we have a president that is African American, and there is still injustices that have happened against them. So it's kind of a constant process here. Civil rights are always kind of evolving. So we have this idea of separate but equal for a while, and it's kind of the idea in the American education system for quite some time. That is until we get to our last case, our third case here. That's Brown v. the Board of Education. I want you to think again for a second. How far do you have to walk to get to school? You take the bus, you get a ride with your parents. Usually the school is pretty close by. If it's too far away, you're offered a bus or you get a ride. Well, let's meet this little girl named Linda Brown. Linda Brown had to walk 6 blocks just to get to her bus stop, and then take that bus further away to get to her segregated blacks-only school. When there was a whites-only school much, much closer to her house. Her father didn't think that was too fair, so he sued. And that case got appealed, and that case got appealed until it went to the highest court in the land, which is the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court argues it again. Now I know what you guys are thinking. The Supreme Court's going to mess up again. They've already said Dred Scott's property. They already created separate but equal. But guess what? This time the Supreme Court gets it right. Finally, right? It's kind of taken them maybe the third time's the charm. The Supreme Court rules Plessy v. Ferguson's idea of separate but equal is unconstitutional. They overturned the ruling of Plessy v. Ferguson, and they say separate but equal is no longer the rule of the land. You must be able to integrate classrooms. You cannot separate blacks only from whites only. So what you have here are 3 landmark Supreme Court cases that had huge implications for civil rights. Dred Scott ruled slaves are property. Plessy v. Ferguson, separate but equal. Brown v. the Board of Education overturns Plessy v. Ferguson. Separate but equal is no longer constitutional. These go a long way into progressing civil rights. It's a shame that it had to take the Supreme Court to overrule these things. But keep in mind, there's a lot more work to be done in civil rights than just these Supreme Court cases. We have an issue of enforcing it. Just because the Supreme Court says classes now have to be integrated, are schools going to be so eager to start integrating? Are blacks going to want to go into white-only schools? How are they going to be treated there? Probably not so well, right? You'll learn about that later on. The Supreme Court cases, in some cases, make egregious mistakes, unthinkable mistakes. How could you say someone is property? And sometimes they make good decisions, like in the Brown v. the Board of Education.